All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Corbin Barthold, Internet Policy Counsel at Tech Freedom and host, of course, of the legendary Tech Policy Podcast, your source for the best news and analysis on AI, TikTok, spacesuits, and pornography. Welcome to Free the Economy, Corbin.
Good to be here on the legendary Free the Economy podcast. I appreciate it, Richard.
Of course, we're doing, all of our listeners know we're doing a very special dual episode today. We're recording for both shows, the Tech Policy Podcast and Free the Economy, in a sort of post-humanist mind meld sort of audio product. So I'm excited for where we're going to go. Uh, so before when we were getting ready to put this show together, we talked about starting with a little background on the two shows and podcasts, and that is a great idea. But also, I think it's worth taking just a moment down memory lane for some of our very young listeners who might not know the history of podcasting itself. So, going back to the ancient prehistory, the 1980s, it was possible to buy books on tape, for example, just like those books we get on Audible.com today. You would get a plastic clamshell case with several audio cassettes, and that was a common way of sharing listenable content. The kind of thing that whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that people might talk about on a podcast, just on several plastic cassettes. Um, the internet changed everything, as we know, and so in the 90s we had AOL.com had some actual downloadable audio shows. There was comedy shows, um, but it wasn't. It was a bit clunky, so it wasn't super popular. Later, we had file sharing apps like Napster, LimeWire, Winamx. Anyone who was a teenager in the 1990s will no doubt remember non-copyright approved use of audio files back then on some of those platforms. But it was really not until the early 2000s, about 2004 or so, I'd say, that podcasting really took off. So that was fueled by the popularity of the iPod, of course, where podcasting gets its name. iPod first came out in 2001, and then podcasts as shows, sort of ongoing shows, the way we usually think of them today, is really a product of like 2003, 2004. And much like the web in general changed content like newspapers, so much so that the tail is sort of wagging the dog at this point, where nytimes.com is almost more important than the actual printed newspaper newyorktimes.com, although it still exists. Podcasts have changed broadcasting and traditional radio dramatically. For example, This American Life show, public radio show we may all be familiar with, first started offering its broadcast episodes as a podcast in 2006. And now This American Life gets about 2.5 million downloads per week, which I think is slightly more than my show.
Right in the neighborhood of our shows. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so it's a lot of background there, but I think it's kind of interesting to think of where we came from with that, and the fact that even though you have the same content, right? Just like the same content that was a printed newspaper that then got posted to a website, you've got the same content that was in a traditional radio broadcast is now in a podcast. Uh, on one level, you would say, oh, it's the same thing in two different formats. Kind of doesn't matter at all. But of course, obviously, the change between those two things has been massive, both for the individuals listening and for the companies and entities that make their living producing it. So, background, podcast, good or bad?
That's so great. I was hoping we would talk sort of about politics and technological change. And one theme of that topic to me is the degree to which material conditions really are more important than great books, seminars, and ideas. Very Marxist concept, I know, but Marshall McLuhan was in fact correct with the medium is the message stuff. On the podcast topic, I'll back in with a story. So I live in Lafayette, California. I hope I'm not giving away uh, anything confidential in saying. Turns out that Dan Pfeiffer also lives in Lafayette, one of the hosts of Pod Save America. And it also turns out further that he and I have children who are the exact same age, very, very young. So there was a birthday party. at his house, and my child was invited. And my wife was saying, yeah, you know what you should do is during the party, go up to him and be like, yeah, man, I got a podcast too. Like you and me, we're the same. Um,
That's the greatest white guy conversation opener of all time.
yes, well, but it gets to the point that it is remarkable the spectrum of podcasts from these podcasts that now are almost taking over. You had a newspaper that then creates a website, and the website's the printed material. And now some of those websites are actually just advertisements for all the podcasts. I do a lot of writing for The Bulwark. Lovely publication. I don't mean this as a bad thing, but you often go on there, and the top 3 or 4 things they're showing you are, hey, here are our most recent podcasts, because it turns out that, I don't know, I guess people want to be listening to their information rather than reading it. That's just how these things evolve. But you go from those. The Bulwark podcast is also one of the most popular politics podcasts in the nation, down to the Tech Policy podcast, which is incredibly wonky. You asked, our podcast good? I host one, so ipso facto, I have to say they're good, right? It's in my contract somewhere. Why is it good? Well, one thing that is good about it is how niche you can get, how much it can be tailored to people's interests. You are no longer stuck with the evening news. Take your pick of CBS, NBC, or ABC, and that's it. You've got your local newspaper, maybe 2 if you're lucky, one that comes in the afternoon, but that's really it. Now you can get the information that you actually want to hear. And one thing we do with the Tech Policy podcast is try to provide an outlet where people can get insights on tech and law and policy in that intersection that is not just law Twitter, which tends to be atrociously bad. Uh, well, a lot of it's actually quite insightful. Getting deeper than often when I read tech policy as described in the New York Times or the Washington Post, I think of the Michael Crichton. I forget the name of it, but you should read all news with the level of credulity that you have after you read an article about something you truly know a lot about.
Yes,
We
the
try to get.
the Gell-Mann amnesia effect.
Thank you.
You
That's um, so that's a fantastic thing. I listen to lots and lots of podcasts because it is a way for me to continue to uptake information that is pertinent to my job. There are lots of other good tech policy podcasts that I listen to do this, especially once you have kids. At least this has been my experience. You have to be very time efficient. So it helps me in my job. It helps me in entertainment, in hearing things that interest me. So maybe we have to later get into the fear of echo chambers and extremism and all the downside of niche media, but I think I take advantage of it.
Yeah, and the nicheification I think is underappreciated. And it reminds me of a book. And as I'm sitting here recording, I'm looking at my other monitor here, a book written by a former podcast host, Adam Davidson, who is one of the people who worked on NPR's Planet Money. So he reported for Planet Money, and then, of course, it was an NPR show, but just like we're saying, also existed as a podcast. And he wrote a book called The Passion Economy several years ago, and it actually wasn't specifically about podcasts, but it definitely applies here, where his point is that the modern economy works on internet platforms. So that's true whether you're selling low-cost manufactured goods from China and you're selling them on Amazon or eBay or Temu. To a great extent, shipping is cheap, which means even if you're working in the physical economy, you still have a global market, which is a thing which we kind of take for granted today, but which historically is a very unusual thing. And so the bigger your market, the more you can segment it, the more you're able to make money off of an increasingly narrower and narrower niche of stuff. So, if you were trying to do this 30 years ago and you were like, you know what, I'm really good at sewing and designing clothes. So you may open a like seamstress or tailor shop and you may make all sorts of clothes for all sorts of people. But today, you can make clothes just for Renaissance fair attendees, right? You can make a good living on eBay and Etsy saying, I will make your Ren Fair costume for you. Um, and if you lived in a small town 30 years ago, There was a little chance that you could even make a living being a seamstress. You certainly couldn't make a living making only fantasy clothes for Ren Fair attendees, but now you can. And so Adam has this, advice, so this is sort of his big picture view of like how the economy is changing, but also practical specific advice for people. Like if you want to start a business, go specific. You can't go too specific. Basically, it's his advice. And uh all the big stuff, the commodity stuff, you'll never be able to compete in a commodity business as a small business person. It's all going to be made in China for tenths of a penny. Don't bother doing that. Be specific, add value to something that you love that you love and are interested in, and that's why he calls it the passion economy. So uh, the bigger your market, the more specific you can be, and still get something out of it, whether it's you're trying to earn a living or if it's just a hobby and an interest. Um, and that global platform makes so many more things possible than was physically possible before. So when it comes to tech policy, we'll probably get into this. The big question is, does tech change the world in a way that we need new laws for? Or is it just kind of we just do it digitally instead of analog, and it's just, you know, a different format? This is one of those cases where it actually has changed the world and what is popular. Um, because you can't uh, first of all, in terms of traditional broadcasting, radio and television, there's only so many outlets. They're very expensive, a lot of overhead in order to have an actual radio station or a TV station. The barrier to entry for podcasters and streamers is, I think, significantly lower, right? Almost zero, really. If you want to be, especially if you already have a smartphone for other reasons, it's now virtually zero. You can get you can get your podcast on a syndication platform. You can get it on YouTube for free. Um, so the barrier to entry is radically lower, but you also have a much bigger audience. Even if you got on, say, before the internet revolution, there were things like local cable access television, right? Where it was possible for a non-broadcast professional to get a local TV show, for example. They were often hilariously low production value, and
Wayne's World being the send up of that era. Yes.
yes, Wayne's World, the classic. I think a lot of people don't realize that the thing Wayne's World was making fun of was, in fact, originally a real thing. So it was, if you really wanted to put in the time and volunteer at your local cable access television station, it was theoretically possible for a non-professional, non-millionaire to get on TV, but still difficult, right? But nothing like what we have today, where people who have no training and no capital can get 1 million followers on YouTube if it just turns out they're really interesting. And I think that's a sort of revolution that it's going to take us multiple decades to digest, really, that we don't even quite understand the full import of yet.
Well, you mentioned find your niche, and that is true in media and ideas, as you just pointed out, as well as making Renaissance Fair outfits. What's the saying? Find 1,000 true fans and you can make a living.
Mhm.
And how do you do that? Well, you do that by having a unique voice. And the concern, of course, is that that means what you encourage is extremism and be the loudest or say the most shocking bit. And that's how you get your audience. So there's a lot of concern that instead of being broad and flat, appeal to the largest possible audience so that advertisers will like you. And that inherently means be a little more insipid or bland, maybe, or don't say controversial things. We now have a media landscape where the incentives are skewed toward saying the most outrageous thing you can and appealing very much to the reptilian brain of your base, so to speak. And so there is a lot of concern about that. I will be having Renee DiResta on the show in a few weeks. She has a book coming out called Invisible Rulers. And it is all about this concern of bespoke bubble realities and how do we navigate a society where we were diverse in the last century and we're diverse now. But back then, maybe it was a little more geographical diversity. Now, you may have very, very different views from the person down the street to you. You may have a community, but it's online and you share the views of people who are scattered across a wide geographical area, whereas you have less in common with the people around you. And is this true? I think these are deeply empirical questions. And going to your point, it took us decades to figure out what the impact of the radio was on society. We're still sorting that out. I think there is a question to be asked of, are we in a era of such rapid technological change in telecommunications and information that we're just going to be riding the wave, man? I mean, you said, is it changing things fundamentally where we need laws? And I hate to be a chaos agent. I think it's changing things fundamentally. I think it's not just, oh, analog and now digital, but also to the point where it may almost be foolhardy to think that we can design a regulatory or legal apparatus that is on this rationalistic foundation, that we channel messages and manage the masses and do some sort of top-down control of communications technology. I don't think it's going to work out that way.
Oh, see, that's the galaxy brain level because first of all, step one is, well, maybe we don't need anything different. Maybe it's not that different. Step two is, oh, there are new threats out there, and now we need new laws and regulations. But step three is like, forget it, baby. You can't even wrap your mind or your regulatory mind around it. It's too crazy.
It's the EAC view of
Mm.
information, effective accelerationists who look at AI and say, bring on the AI god. I'm not saying I'm an EAC person, but in the realm of information, yeah, anybody who tells you I can control this is foolhardy. And we have a lot of really bad tech policy out there that is pretending to be able to do that. That's actually a big theme of the Tech Policy podcast, is taking apart really dumb tech policy ideas. We're kind of the Calvin Coolidge adage that it's better to take down bad bills than to pass good ones at some point.
Well, yeah, and I think there's some people will say like, "Oh no, it's not too complicated. I can design a system of rules that applies to this." Well, you can design a system. That doesn't mean it's going to be a good system or that it will yield a like net positive effects. That's sort of the like the short, snappy response, which is like, "Oh no, it's not too complicated. I think I know how to work, how to manage it," but you don't, and realizing you don't is part of the deeper wisdom. So
I think that ties into a deeper philosophical issue, fermenting, particularly on the right, because conservatives were long had the strong Hayekian streak, the knowledge problem, the planning fallacy, and now that is being challenged by a range of views. National conservatives, let's put them under that umbrella, but it's much more complicated than that, who have forgotten that and want to get back to sort of planning the future. And I think the Hayekian insight actually remains surprisingly powerful. It's not zombie Reaganism, it's still true.
uh, okay, so I want to get back to that sort of the topic of like what do conservatives think about all this, but quickly let's jump into the sort of thing we truncated, which is like the history of our shows. We'll do the real quick background on where my show came from and where your show came from, and then we'll get into the slipstream of big ideas. So my background here with this, and the part of why I sort of like led in with this is like the prehistory of podcasts. They started in 2004, and all that was that I've got kind of one foot back in that ancient world. So I started CEI's first podcast. We called it Liberty Week. So it was a weekly commentary on kind of news and politics. And so we did that from 2008 to 2010, and I loved it. I thought it was a great show. So I co-hosted it for a while with Cord Bloomquist, who now has been an IT guy running his own like web resource company for many years, but at the time he was working with us. And there weren't a lot of competitors back then, right? Some groups now they have like, whether they're publications or like nonprofits or these activist groups, they've got two or three different podcasts and they're like, subscribe to all of them and they're coming out every week and every quarter and every month. There were a lot fewer back then, so we kind of felt like we were on the cutting edge. Um, And then I went to the Tax Foundation. I did their podcast. They've changed the name of it, but back then it was just called the Tax Policy Podcast. That was like 2010, 2013, and that was one which is probably even more niche and wonky than Tech Policy Podcast because it was all about taxes. Can you imagine the person who every week they go to the gym and they're like, I got to put the Tax Policy Podcast on my iPad, on my iPod, but that was our
Thousand true
audience.
fans.
And then not with me, but yeah, I had something called the Real Clear Radio Hour with Bill Frezza. So that was sponsored by the Real Clear Foundation. Bill Frezza was actually a tech investor. He was a big VC guy for many years before he did that show with us. And that was actually a hybrid because it was on some broadcast stations as well. So it's every podcaster's they get to be a real boy like Pinocchio, who are like, we're actually on broadcast radio in addition to doing a podcast. And then finally in 2022 we put together this show, Free the Economy, and we spent a lot of time doing these project management meetings about what do we want it to be, what's the format, what's our audience, how much do we time do we want to spend on it, which is of course something you should do before you launch a new project. And then we did in December. So and now we're up to episode we're in the 70s now. Um, and so I feel like I've seen a lot of these sort of changes and a lot of this growth and proliferation. Now you have a lot more competition, but you also have more people who are looking to listen via podcast as well. And that's one thing I think that kind of people forget about in the business world. When you get an industry that scales up, you say, well, why would I go into that? There's so much competition. It's like, but there's also growth, right? You should want to go into a growth market. And the fact that there's more than two people to compete against is a sign that it's dynamic and growing, not a sign that you should pull out. Um, but uh, but now I want to hear the lore, the backstory of the Tech Policy Podcast.
Well, I'm a lucky boy. I inherited the Tech Policy Podcast. So shout out to Evan Schwartztraber, founded the podcast in 2016 on behalf of my organization, Tech Freedom. My organization, the organization I work for. He hosted it for a good while, and then the next host was Ashkan Kazarian. She always says I mispronounce her name. I'm sorry. I try
We
every time, Ash.
we just call her Ash.
Um,
We love her.
and then she went on to greener pastures, and we needed a new host. And the conversation for a while was that we would rotate it, and somehow I just tripped in. I thought of myself as the interim host for a solid 50 episodes, just keeping the seat warm, and slowly accepted the reality that I actually do this. So we've had one or two law students, bless them, who listen to every episode all the way through. To anybody who wants to do that, I apologize. It was slow going. I learned the early episodes. It took me a while to get moving, but it's really a lot of fun. I get to nerd out when I read something interesting on the internet. I can invite a person on. I can kind of star chase by my lights. It was great to what's an example, like Noah Phillips as an FTC commissioner. Wow, that's really great for me. So mainly I'm just totally selfish and doing it because it's fun and I enjoy it. I enjoy having tech policy conversations with people who I consider to be stars in the field. But to the extent there is a mission, and it is sort of shooting down bad tech policy ideas in DC, which is easily, there's plenty to do in that regard. One, you mentioned TikTok, so one recent episode was just getting into, okay, so you want to pass a TikTok bill. Have you really thought this through? And a very long, extended discussion of the bill that they actually passed, the answer being, no, you really didn't. So a lot of that kind of stuff. Another recent example is red states now wanting to age gate the internet. And I think that actually ties in this weird way to our deeper discussion, because I think in particular on the right, we spent a lot of time going after dumb left-wing ideas too, but there is a brain drain in the tech policy world on the right, perhaps as there is in the larger intellectual firmament in that area. And so we find ourselves trying to fill that vacuum is not quite the right word. We're not trying to necessarily tell them how to do their jobs better, but I spent a lot of time saying, look, even if these are the things you want to do, what you're doing, it's just bad craftsmanship. It's just poorly thought through. So that's the Tech Policy Podcast. I have a great time doing it. If you're into wonky tech policy conversations, please do check us out. Unlike you, I don't give my mission statement at the beginning of every episode. Free the Economy is very good about that. So you're kind of better defined.
Yeah, no, I think I read a book about advertising about 15 years ago about how you should always drill your drill into your mission statement as many times as possible, as often as possible, as clearly as possible. You can never repeat yourself enough when you want people to focus on if you want people to focus on your mission. And so
I'm terrible about that. Yeah, I heard George Stigler say that. If you want to win a Nobel Prize, you got to just write the same paper over and over and over again. And
I
I'm
keep
not
I
great
keep
at that.
telling people, I'm the king of recycling, not environmental policy recycling, but of just recycling things that you've written already, freshened up, for a new date. Because it turns out not every single person in the world read that op-ed that I wrote in 2009. Turns out a few people missed it. So if I
Turns out,
paraphrase it,
yeah, it's like 3 people who are law students who've listened to every episode of my show. And a shout out to you guys. You're my favorite. But yeah, not typical.
uh, so but yes, bring us to what do conservatives care about with tech policy, and why do we care about what they care about? So one of the things that new developments in technology do is they disrupt the status quo, kind of by definition. If it's a significant enough technology, then it's going to be disruptive. So the general conservative frame of mind would say, oh gosh, well we're maybe going to be skeptical of technology, period, just because of that. Whereas someone who likes change and dynamism and is looking for maybe they don't like the status quo and they want a completely different world, right? The people from the more progressive left side would, on balance, on average, be expected to be more excited about new technology. So that's the sort of temperamental thing, which we can kind of say we kind of expect that to be the case. Um, but then there's the specific impacts of any particular disrupting technology, and obviously what it is depends on how riled up people get about it. And so this reminds me of and so looking back in the history, well, what big disruptive technologies have we seen in the past, and how did people respond to them? Reminds me of yet another great podcast, the Pessimist Archive. They've since changed the name, but it was hosted by Jason Pfeiffer, who's the editor in chief of Entrepreneur Magazine, and that is a wild ride. Yeah, you should follow the Twitter handle. I think is still around, Pessimist Archive. But he goes back and tells a story about all these different technologies for the past, I don't know, 100, 150, 200 years, and a lot of the sort of social panics that have evolved around them. His basic point is that a lot of the social panics weren't really based on anything, and they were just people panicking because things changed. But if you look at what people wrote about, like the bicycle was considered a very feminist invention, by the way. Um, but the the kind of horror stories about all the terrible things that were going to happen because everyone was riding bicycles were completely wild, right? There are people who wrote newspaper columns saying that people who ride bicycles at a fast pace are going to permanently change the shape of their face because the fast wind racing past it is going to sort of mold it in this weird plasticized way, and they're going to get permanent bicycle face. I mean, and that's just one, right? There's lots of other kind of wacky criticisms for at the time when bicycling was becoming a thing in the say 1890s or so. And he is and Jason has lots of other examples like this about whether they're like detective comics or pinball machines, or going something more recent like the 1980s pagers. Teenagers having pagers was going to be the end of the world, right? Before everything was the fault of smartphones, pagers were really scary. Uh, and and so I that history, there are many waves of that history, well over 100 years, has made, I think, inoculated me against some automatic tech panics, right? Whether it's TikTok or whether it's some of the work that like Jonathan Haidt and other people have been doing about saying that smartphones are terrible for teenagers and that they should all be getting rid of. There may be something there, and if there's good empirical research, we should look at it. But I'm much less likely to automatically assume that some new widespread technology is terrible just because there's been so much terrible criticism in that vein so many decades in the past.
There is, I think, a bit of a horseshoe in our politics right now with technology. On the far left, you have degrowther types who, I'm sorry, basically want us to live in caves and be poor and miserable. That's exaggerating, but only slightly. The center left at this point, I think of as they want us to be more like Europe, where they claim they favor innovation, but by the time they're through telling you all the caveats and regulations that they're going to put on that, it actually means stasis in practice. There's the center right, which I think remains pro tech mostly, except for America's best, largest tech companies who they despise with a passion. So that's sort of weird and incoherent. And then once you get over to the far right, you actually have people who sound a lot like the far left using different buzzwords, but it's the same idea. I think of, say, like Michael Warren Davis writing The Reactionary Mind, where basically he's saying, you don't understand, serfs were actually very happy. And that's what we should be striving to move back toward. So interestingly to me, there's not a lot of tech optimism anywhere on that spectrum. Like even you look at the left and Wired, like the tech optimist publications have become these pessimistic anti-tech uh, rags, and it's very surprising. And yet we continue to roll along. I've brought up on the show a couple times the concept of the technium, and are things sort of capable? Is one of those things where technological advance, we've unleashed the beast, and this is going to kind of just keep happening unless we all go Ted Kaczynski. It's a very strange time where people are very angry. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of anger at tech, and yet it just keeps rolling and actually, in hindsight, as you were saying, keeps making life better. And I have to wonder if that's because there's a lot of decadence, might be the word, or luxury beliefs would be one way to put it. I live in California, in the suburbs, among a lot of other people who are raising kids. They're far to my left. They have extremely left wing opinions if you're talking to them around the dinner table, but actually, they get surprisingly conservative when it comes to the education of their kids. And I think it's similar with technology. There's not a lot of people who actually don't want the advances in dealing with blood cancers and who would get rid of this way of life. I think there's a surface level anger at information technologies in particular. And we'll see if that eventually tips over and results in real concrete action. Certainly, the TikTok bill would be an example of a push in that regard. Um, but we live in a strange time. I think the underlying dynamic that is going on is a lot of people have forgotten that the number one interest of almost everyone is they don't like being poor. People who actually lived under post World War II rationing in Great Britain were much better. Auberon, this stodgy conservative who readily acknowledged that, life is better than it used to be. And it's because they actually knew what privation was. And I wonder how long we'll stagger forth and if we'll have to learn hard lessons when some of these shouting anti-tech people, if they ever finally get what they want, they may get it good and hard, and realize that a lot of this was just talk. We'll see.
Well, yeah, as a leading poverty disrespecter myself, I agree that uh, we will criticize some of these things and some of these sort of like market processes at much at our peril, and that it may in fact require some harsh lessons. I mean, look, like you said, compared to like the U.S., compared to Europe, compared specifically to the governance of the EU, right? Sometimes we think about Europe and the EU as coterminous. They're not exactly, but uh, they they sort of want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to talk about having a you know a vibrant ecosystem of companies, including innovative companies like tech companies. But they also say, okay, but except for these 27 things that would be necessary in order to actually have a vibrant tech sector. So they're like, well, we aren't saying you can't be successful and innovative. We just say you have to do it in this extremely prescriptive, specific way, which, as it turns out, yields almost no really large tech companies in Europe. And this reminds me, this is an anecdote I've shared on the show before, but it reminds me of several years ago. I was at a conference here in DC, and it was a sort of a horseshoe themed conference as well. It was about antitrust, and it said, uh, usually it's people on the left wing who want more vigorous antitrust enforcement and breaking up big tech companies. But now, this now was like in 2018 or something, more conservatives are saying, oh, maybe we want that too. Maybe we think some of these big companies are too big. And so the American Conservative hosted this conference with both people left side and right side speakers, and one of the panels in the afternoon of this day, I think, was really uh, produced the most important anecdote, which is there was a woman who was a antitrust attorney. She was a competition attorney and sort of policymaker in Europe. And someone asked her, there's a question from the crowd saying, you've talked about why you think the EU's technology regulation, competition regulation is so great, but doesn't it give you pause given the fact that there's no really large tech companies in Europe, right? There's US companies, there's some up and coming Chinese companies, maybe a couple Japanese companies, but there really aren't any European companies. Isn't that a sign that maybe the Europe tech regulation is not so great? And she just did not stop for a second. She didn't miss a beat. She's like, oh no, we see the companies that this policy has kept out are bad companies. They do bad things, like Google and Meta and all the the FANG company, all the biggest companies. And so it's actually a validation of how good our regulation is that we don't have any of those companies, because those would all be bad companies. Um, I'm not sure how reassuring that is to the VCs operating in Europe that is the attitude. But basically that if our policy had allowed one of the biggest, most dominant companies in the world, then that ipso facto would be proof that we hadn't regulated enough. So it's good there aren't any. Do you think the Europe tech sector will be really successful with that attitude, Corbin?
Really, really chucking a softball at me. You may have noticed, it sounds perhaps like there's a tension when I say, wow, are we in a technium? Will this happen no matter what? And then in the next breath, I say, wow, the Europeans are really good at just choosing to be poor. So if we broaden the lens out, wow, Google's so evil. What's the alternative? Well, if America became Europe and we killed our tech companies, we'll still have tech companies. They will just be under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. Somebody is going to do tech innovation in the world. That's something that's pretty reliable. I don't think we're going to have a global movement back to
Abacuses?
dumb phones and remember the scientific calculators we all had when we were in middle school. We're not going back to that.
I mean, I had a slide rule, but
So I try to measure my contempt when I talk about Europe. It's not productive. I will just put it in blunt terms, though. They are making a decision to be poor. They're choosing to be poor. If you look at their GDP, their wealth, over the last 20 years, they have decided that they no longer want to be competitive with the United States. And I am a firm believer that that's a choice, that it ties into other larger trends. Maybe we shouldn't get sidetracked into birth rates and what's going, is there something spiritual here, or what's going on? But there's something in the European mindset that has become incredibly risk averse. And I don't know why anybody left or right. So the left in America looks at that and goes, oh, that would be awesome. We should get rid of our large tech companies. And that confuses me. And then the reactionary or traditionalist right, I don't think they necessarily want to emulate Europe, but they would get that in practice. This weird. Well, let me back up half a step. John Asconis actually had a good article in Compact on the notion that there is no such thing as traditionalism in technologically innovative society, and that conservatives kind of fooled themselves into thinking that that is a thing, and they need to get with the program and understand that technology is here. It is changing society radically. That doesn't mean you can't have a conservative mindset, but it has to take the shape of, here are these technologies, they exist. What are conservative policies in light of that brute fact? And he gives a lot of good examples, but one is like dating apps. So if you're some kind of traditionalist conservative, you'd say, people should go to church, they should meet in church, they should find their future spouse in church, and that's how it should work. Well, if you look, that's not what's going on. People use dating apps. They are massively influential. They bring about a massive number of the couplings that lead to marriage in our society. So a conservative at this point instead needs to be thinking, what would a conservative dating app look like? What affordances would it provide to help people get married to the right kind of partner? Because they're
It's
here
called
to stay.
christianmingle.com
There you go.
or eHarmony. I mean, that is a good point that if you want to be a traditionalist in the modern world, and you want to actually live you don't want to live in a monastery, you want to actually live in society, you have to accommodate yourself to some extent to the society that exists.
The alternative being that if you smash the machines, actually, I return to my point. Most people actually don't like being poor. And if you actually want to see nasty politics, do stasis and make people poor. And it's not going to be people smoking their pipe, being happy on their farm in a regression to traditional agrarianism. It's going to be very angry people with sticks in the street smashing things up in a time of revolution. That doesn't sound very conservative to me.
Right. People fighting over shares of a shrinking pie is when society gets really unpleasant. Um,
Unconservative
Yeah. Oh, and
in all
it's certainly
directions. Yes.
if conservatism means, among other things, ordered liberty, order, and not chaos, generally, conservatives would be against the side of violent chaos. Then yes, then you don't want that. But I think there are plenty of examples where conservatives and conservatives communities have been doing exactly that, which is adapting to the current modern world with its technology left and right, including eHarmony and ChristianMingle.com. Not not making fun of Christian Mingle. If you're looking for a Christian boyfriend and girlfriend, get on there. Um, but also as we saw in COVID, for example, a lot of churches, some of them had been doing this before, but a lot more started during COVID. Um, they're live streaming services now, right? And so
Yeah,
you
yeah. I mean,
have,
can I just pause you there?
yeah,
So, my father died last year, and I actually quite like this. Is the pandemic? We have a recording of that. It's on YouTube. It's a private link for us, but that will exist in perpetuity. And pre-pandemic, we would not have had that.
mm,
So that is very much a weird intermarriage of technological change and a promotion of, you might call it, traditionalism. I mean, this was in a very high Episcopalian church. It was this lovely service, and I will be able to show that to my kids, which will theoretically influence them as they hear the Book of Common Prayer or whatever. Sorry, go ahead.
well, yeah, and the there are plenty of examples of religious and traditionalist groups making use of new technology. The LDS Church is legendary for the amount of time and effort that they have put into genealogical research and something called the International Genealogical Index, which has which they use for their own purposes, but also has yielded, I guess we could call it that, a positive externality to lots of other people who are not religiously inclined, but are doing genealogical research of their own. Um, all of these, like you said, the live streams and recordings of either special one-time events like a baptism or a funeral, or just weekly mass and lessons. Uh, those are things that didn't exist before, but can certainly be very valuable for people who are uh, co-religionists who are part of any particular parish or religious background. When the church I go to here in Washington D.C., which is also a high church Episcopalian experience, we had a 150th anniversary several years back, and so I was on the sort of volunteer committee to sort of put together our kind of history of the parish and put together sort of a little exhibition on all the places. the times, the life and times of 150 years in a parish, and it was very uneven. Let's just say that throughout the stuff from 150 years ago was a little thin, and in part that's because creating and maintaining archives 150 years ago was more expensive in time, both in terms of actual output, the money you spent, but in terms of the time, sort of volunteer hours that people in the church would put forward. Uh, and now maintaining both creating rich multimedia material as well as, maintaining them and classifying them in the future is much less expensive. So we get much more of it. Right. If I mean, in a way, it made my job easier that we had so little original material because I would have had to like look at a lot more stuff. Right. If 150 years from now, they'll have, thousands of hours of live stream masses and services, and it'll sorry, future volunteers, we've created a lot more work for you, but
You
the
will
point is
ask
we
the
have a
AI,
lot more
give me
material.
clips of this or that highlight, and it will do it. Apparently, we'll use tech to solve tech. Apparently,
Yes, AI bot, just find me cool stuff and then put it and then edit it into a 5 minute video, done. Right. uh so yes, technology is a challenge to people who value tradition, but it is also a valuable tool, can also be a valuable tool for preserving tradition, and I don't think we should just forget about that.
I think that's a great point. I think nostalgia shouldn't be underestimated here, and the sheer power of nostalgia. And I think people also underestimate the degree to which everything pretty much is constructed, and everything is ersatz, and very little in the world is authentic. And actually, every generation is called to find meaning and spirituality um, in their own way. I mean, in the the people who rediscovered the Romans, they thought statues were cool that were plain and white. They didn't understand that the Romans made them these garish rainbow things, and they made a new meaning. They had this image in their head of Roman austerity, and it captured their imagination of what proper civic behavior looked like. And I know the painting of the statues is a small example, but we see this everywhere. Um, People constantly constructing meaning and creating a tradition that is largely fake. Thomas Jefferson thinking that the Anglo-Saxons had this romantic liberty before the Normans came, and they were all happy as these yeoman farmers. There's a movie called The Tao of Steve, great movie. And in the director's commentary, they talk about this. What is spirituality if you live in you're a white dude living in New Mexico, and they talk about a spiritual experience can come in a Denny's diner at 10 a.m.
Mhm.
You go and find it. It's there. It's in the trees in your backyard. If you have to go to a 15th century cathedral in France, and that's the only way you can think you're having some kind of spiritual experience, there's an argument to be made that you're doing it wrong. And I think a lot of people right now are having a hard time sort of accepting that, and accepting where they are, and accepting America for what it is, and embracing what we have in the American tradition, which is messy and totally crazy. Um, and instead are reaching for things like Catholic integralism, as if being under the yoke of a ultramontanist pope is somehow fits comfortably within the American tradition, which is all about kicking nobles in the shins and tar and feathering the tax collector and the whiskey rebellion. And anyway, I'm gushing at this point, but there's a lot here in our
Mhm.
crazy American tradition if you just embrace it without needing to pine for some romantic past that may or may not have existed and may or may not be compatible with modern life.
Well, yeah, and I think you don't have to show any disrespect to people who came before us and lived a different way to say we can also live great now. I think
Absolutely.
that there is something in there where, if, people, if you say, well, like, well, the great church fathers in the early centuries of the church, uh, my life is so different from theirs. It's almost as if I'm disrespecting them to be so different, and I don't think that that's true at all. I was reading something about the change from hand copying to printing, so the origins of mechanical printing in Europe in the 15th century. There was a guy named Johann Tremithist. He was a 15th century German monk. He was a Benedictine abbot, and he wrote an essay, which ironically was then mechanically printed and distributed for people to read, about why it was bad that monks would no longer be hand copying the scriptures, basically. And with much cheaper mechanical printing of the Bible, started with Gutenberg and Caxton in England. Uh, a lot of people were saying at the time that, oh, well, we won't need any of these hand copied manuscripts anymore. And our abbot Prometheus was saying, well, no, there's all sort of reasons why it's good. It's good to contemplate the scriptures slowly, and of course, copying, hand copying is very slow. But he was saying, but there's a virtue to that, right? It's good that it's slow because it allows the people who are doing the copying to think very, seriously about it. And he had a whole defense about why hand copying is better than mechanical printing. But uh, one, I would say it's still possible to hand copy manuscripts. It's not very popular these days, but it's entirely possible. And if you would like to undertake that, sometimes we call it journaling. But if instead of writing your own original journal thoughts, if you wish to hand copy a passage, it's entirely possible for you to do that. And think about it. It's interesting, meditative and spiritual practice. But the other thing, which I think maybe some later Protestant critics might have pointed out, which is it better than a tiny handful of monks get the advantage of hand copying the Bible, or that millions of people get to own and read their own Bible in their homes?
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I'm anti woke with the best of them, but I do think Zadie Smith has a point when she says that particularly for a certain category of white male, it's a little easier to be nostalgic about the past because your rights have been established for a lot longer than some other people.
Mhm.
And I could go further than that and say, when I think about the past, and I have to remind myself of this too, everybody, when they look back at whatever Tudor England, they assume they'd be the aristocrats.
Yes.
And when you think about the past, no, statistically speaking, let's face it, it is overwhelmingly likely you would be the serf in the mud. You wouldn't have the the beautiful manuscript with the capital letters that have all the art around them. You would be tilling a field, losing your children to disease and famine, scratching out a living. Going back to my headline point of this podcast, people actually really don't like being poor. And most people really would rather do something else besides manual labor. There's talk of bullshit jobs in America. And I don't disagree that there's some pretty dumb, paper pushy email jobs. The question always being, compared to what? Would you
Mhm.
rather be working with a pickaxe all day? And so I think going to a conservative value, I think gratitude. We all should remember that if we were drawing straws to repopulate the past, you are almost certainly the miserable peasant.
Or someone who died when you were 18 months old of a
Yes,
yeah.
yes, that is well. And I think that really, to me at least, that obliterates almost every romanticist argument about the past.
And so, this sort of started by, us saying what, you know, how do conservatives look at tech? How can you be a conservative if tech is sort of, inherently a discombobulating force on society? And so we said, well, if you're a conservative and you're looking for a mate, you can go to, christianmingle.com instead of, Grinder. Um, but I think that's also true for any other subset in society. And you sort of talked about before, before we jump back into our respective podcast histories, um, that what does it mean that instead of everyone watching the nightly news, instead there's 1,000 different groups of people on different Twitch streams and different subreddits and on different Discord servers, and we're all kind of like doing our own little thing in our own little cool, fun way. And isn't there are and aren't we losing something, right? Because we don't have as much in common because we're so specific. And you know, just like you said about being a person whose rights are well established versus someone maybe who is not, uh, it's easy for someone who is in the majority or who considers themselves to be in the mainstream to say that to people who have interests who are outside the mainstream. Right. So I was in a very interesting discussion. This is one of these very think tank wonky discussion things where they invite a bunch of people for a weekend and you go to a hotel and you all sit in a room and you think big thoughts, which is I think somehow people think think tanks people do every day. It's actually very rare that you just do that, but this is one of those Chatham House rule discussions. So you can't, you can tell other people what they talked about, but you can't say who said what. So that's what I'll do. Um, and we were having exactly this conversation. And there were some people in the room who said, yeah, isn't it? That's really bad that everyone is on their computer doing their own little virtual world thing and they're not going out to, this is sort of the bowling alone thesis. It's bad that we're not all going out to the same usual social events that are in our physical communities. You should be going to the local county fair. You should be going to the local church festival. You should be going to the local main street, whatever it is. And it's sort of heads were nodding around the table. They're like, yeah, yeah, that's right. And I just said, do you guys not know what it's like to be an outcast? Do you not know what it's like to be the only person in a small town who's like you? And they sort of thought, I think the answer was no. But the point is, some of the people who spend a lot of their time in insular online communities have already been preemptively be rejected by a lot of the people around them. Sometimes they live in small towns, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're the least popular kid at their high school or their junior high, right? And to say, "Oh, well, you should be going out and running in the three-legged race at the like church festival." It's like, well, maybe you come from a background where the people who are organizing that three-legged race have made it clear you're not really welcome. And so that is a big reason why a lot of people are in like, you know, spend a lot of time designing their furry avatar so they can go on the subreddit to be in the one place where people don't tell them to get lost.
Absolutely. And I actually wrote a piece in Law and Liberty called The Search for Online Community, where I vented my frustration at a lot of politics are very contingent. You can picture, this idea is not at all unique to me. You can picture a future where it was the conservatives who were the strong environmentalists. And there's a lot of negative polarization in politics where because the quote unquote other side is one thing, we become another. And with social media, can we just stop for a moment and marvel at how weird it is that the right, the conservatives, are the ones who are defending your right to be a harassing, racist lunatic on social media? They frame it on other topics, some of which have some legitimacy to them about COVID misinformation and that crackdown and all that. But at the end of the day, if you actually read the laws that get passed, like Florida or Texas's social media laws, what they are in fact sticking up for is your right to say that 5G causes COVID and there's the Holocaust never happened and all that kind of stuff. Rather uncivilized things that a certain brand of conservative would have been appalled at in the not too recent past. And so, what would a conservative project, as it were, look like with social media? And I would have thought 10 years ago, if I were looking at this, that it would look very different than what we actually have. Actually, perhaps even the opposite of what we have, where instead of everybody fighting to be at the top of the hill of a major platform with their bullhorn, being very, very angry and very, very political, we'd be looking to decentralize and make local community and have a lot of spaces on social media where people can find their kindred souls and discuss their interests in a civilized manner. And it seems very contingent to me as a matter of history that that's not the quote conservative project for internet discourse.
Yeah, and it also makes me wonder where we go from here because I feel like a lot of this, like you said, some of this is changing so fast. It's sort of changing too fast to be intelligently regulated, assuming it would be possible to intelligently regulate it in the first place. The question of like, well, what happened with the crackdown over COVID, supposed COVID misinformation? where the White House and the CDC were sending emails back and forth between Twitter and Facebook, uh, and that people's negative reaction to being shadow banned and censored on social media has, with the apparent now connivance of government agents, uh, has shifted people's attitudes about things. Well, I mean, that was only a few years ago, right? And so if something like that, which is obviously, albeit a major event, can shift people's attitudes so much, what's going to happen 3 years from now? And one, how does that change what we might want to like institute in law? But also, how is that going to change the sort of, the all important thing, the narrative of who's on what side? In,
Yeah.
like you said, we are at a place now where it's sort of a counterintuitive view that the conservative side seems to be speaking up for the right to be disgusting and horrible um, online. But is that going to change again 3 years from now? Right, because of, I don't know, the next Two Live Crew, explicit, pop music controversy.
For sure. And it ties into the topic of material interests and power structures influencing people's attitudes. I think we live in a very strange timeline. And for those who may be wondering, as a side note, why am I talking so much about conservatives? I viewed myself as conservative. I'm from California, and circa 2012, I thought I was conservative, and I got hit by a train. I didn't really 2016 happened, and I think there is a degree to which I was naive about what propped up the Republican Party, and as a result, maybe it's just me continuing to do a long postmortem, but I'm very interested in conservative politics and conservative sort of philosophy, maybe growing out of that history. So, side note over, we live in this strange timeline where conservatives are basically heretics. They are outside of, they don't run the New York Times, they don't run NPR. Um, Throughout the history of conservatism, going back to the French Revolution, conservative meant defenders of the power structure, throne and altar, uh, or whatever the tradition is of a given country, which is another fascinating aspect of conservatism, is that it's not necessarily ideologically coherent or consistent. It's very contingent on the conditions in a given country at a different point in history. But even putting that aside, what does it mean to be, quote, conservative when you are the outsider, um, and the dissident? And I think ultimately that leads to a lot of angry shouting, irritable gestures, as was once thrown that way. So I think, going to your point of how will things be tomorrow and the day after, I think there's a lot of figuring out that needs to be done on the American right in particular, about what does it mean and what does it stand for. I don't want to dive down the rabbit hole of the fact that right now there is a massive thought vacuum at the top of that pyramid, for reasons that obviously don't need elaboration. But one day, the current de facto leader of the party will have moved on, and people are going to have to try to reconstruct what does it mean to be conservative in America. And yes, people will say right now there's this or that book but at a high level, in terms of the national party, no, a lot of work needs to be done on that. That's a ginormous question mark.
Yeah, and I think from whatever angle you're looking at this as, from whatever place on the ideological spectrum, it's often said that when one of the two major political parties in this country, for example, is sort of like on the skids, the generous thing to say is that, well, for better or worse, we want a Democratic and a Republican Party that stand for something and that are coherent, right? Even if you're a Republican, you should want a Democratic Party that's not crazy, and if you're a Democrat, you should want a Republican Party that's not crazy, because in a two-party system, one of the parties isn't going away. Let's be honest. It might get hijacked by people you like even less, so there is plenty of room for maybe more of a vacuum on one side than the other, but there's still plenty of room for tech policy thought leadership, which obviously is why you need to always subscribe to and listen to the Tech Policy Podcast.
Yes, I think the conservative world, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance here. If you look at the state of the political leadership of the party that is the Republican Party, that's roughly the stand in for conservatives, and the conservative movement, which still believes in high culture and great books and ideas, and there's a real contradiction there. And to the extent I'm speaking to the right, although I hope to speak to everybody, I'm hoping to wake people up to the fact that there actually needs to be some thought about technological change and how to accommodate that and make it work for society in a way that makes us all happy. And I, for one, am not finding answers to that question in Aristotle or Homer, much as I like to read those things.
It's, Aristotle did not have a lot to say about 5G conspiracy theories.
I looked in there for his thoughts on smartphones, and
Well,
it's
there
a
you go. Well,
stretch to find anything.
that's why y'all got to listen to us instead. Uh, all right. I really threatened to go full Joe Rogan and try and make this like a 4 hour interview, but we gotta respect everyone's time. Uh, just a reminder, you can of course find Free the Economy on all popular podcasting platforms. You can also find us on Twitter at free_the_economy. And Corbin, where should everyone look for you?
Oh, I'm very boring. I still put most of my work on my Twitter, X Twitter account. I have a Substack called Policy and Palimpsests where I think out loud that you can find me. Just Google my name. I'm around. I write for City Journal and The Bulwark and Reason. I know that's an interesting triangle. I like to think of myself ideologically as kind of sitting in the center of that triangle. It's a comfortable spot for me, and other outlets beyond that. So
All
I'm
right.
around.
Thanks for being with us, Corbin.